Arwa, thanks so much for joining us. Your work, not just as a journalist, but as a humanitarian, if I may say, and your commitment to the cause of helping and supporting people and children who've been impacted by conflict and war is extremely inspiring. I know it must not be always easy to be out there to capture these stories, to tell these stories. It probably is heartbreaking at times, maybe even enraging. So can you just tell us, like, how do you do this? Like, what keeps you going?
Um, a couple of different factors, and thank you for having me. On the one hand, there is this realization and recognition that no matter how difficult things are, in many ways, the harder it gets, the more important our jobs become in terms of needing to tell these kinds of stories. And at the end of the day, we go there by choice. The people whose stories we're reporting on, they're not there by choice. And they deserve so much better than what they're actually seeing and being exposed to in life. And yes, it is enraging. I recently wrote an op-ed that was meant to be for World Humanitarian Day that starts off talking about how angry I am at the trajectory of our evolution as a species, where being a humanitarian has become a thing as opposed to actually being the norm. And it is a lot of turbulent emotions when you're out there in these circumstances. But at the end of the day, when you realize that you have the ability to help someone, even if it's as simple as telling their story or sitting there and listening to them, I believe that that is a moral obligation that we have.
Just because you talk about these stories, the stories you have told are so powerful. I've followed your work for years now, and some of the stories, like I was even going through some of your talks, like the story of Yusuf, or the story of this girl or child, 10-year-old child in Syria who was sent out to bring gasoline because the mother couldn't. So I want to understand from you, from somebody who's covered wars, from somebody who's covered the Syrian war at such length and such depth from the ground, on the ground when you see people impacted by the conflict, tell us about what you see in terms of not just the physical injuries, but also the kind of mental trauma, the mental illnesses, or the sufferings that they go through, which is not visible to the common eye, to the human eye.
It is, and it's one of those things that is really so difficult to encapsulate, because even people that have been through these scenarios, that have been through war, the violence, the bombing, the having to flee, the adults don't know how to actually put their mental state into words. And I think one of the moments that was perhaps the most striking for me, and really did actually encapsulate the depth of the trauma of what it is that a lot of these populations go through, happened earlier this year in February in Idlib province in Syria. And there, the Russians and the Assad regime were carrying out this systematic bombing campaign. And you had those very dramatic images of everyone fleeing towards the border with Turkey, just a complete and total backlog, traffic jam of vehicles, people on foot trying to get away. And so we were filming this, and we had spoken to a family with a little girl who, it was freezing cold, by the way, freezing cold. And most of these kids didn't have proper shoes on. And this little girl just had on a pair of, plastic slippers. She didn't even have socks. She'd been walking all night. She wasn't crying. Another parent who we met and spoke to had just told her children that they had to leave their stuffed animals behind. They did not cry. And that was what was so striking, is all of these kids in these circumstances, hungry, cold, tired, scared, they weren't crying. And in many ways, the fact that they weren't crying was just so telling about what the psychological impact of what it is that they have gone through truly is, and just how profound it is, and just how deeply scarring it is. And, when that kind of trauma is not addressed, when they're not shown anything else to kind of balance out their narrative in life that's going to be a counterforce to that kind of a trauma. I mean, what kind of a chance does a child like that even have?
As a storyteller, how do you tell these stories in a space where there's been the sense of fatigue over stories of people escaping and fleeing, people becoming refugees, people looking for safer spaces? How do you ensure that people are listening, people realize that the stories you're telling about refugees or people who've been inflicted by war and conflict are real stories and that their suffering is real?
It's hard, and this was also a challenge, that we faced when we were covering the war in Iraq. But there is a lot of viewer apathy out there. There is a lot of, oh well, we've seen this before, and I think that's where the challenge and the burden of responsibility is on us, journalists, to a certain degree, to keep telling these stories and constantly looking for different ways to try to connect people to one another. It's all about finding those small connections, those things that a parent might be able to relate to, for example. So in that story I was just telling you, I mean, anyone who's a parent out there has seen their child throw a tantrum, and the fact that these kids weren't, that's a point that parents can perhaps relate to. It's really trying to look for those smaller details, but at the end of the day, it becomes less about recognizing that you're going to make a massive difference when you do go out there and tell these stories, because it's not just viewer apathy that we're up against. There's also the other reality, and that is that the power of journalism. You go in as a journalist and you think that when you cover something horrific, surely something must happen to change the course of that nightmare. And Syria and other conflicts have taught us that that's not the case, that there is no more accountability to a certain degree. And so you end up going over and over again, because, at least for me, it's to document history. It's so that those who are carrying out the violence, those who may win the wars, are not the ones who get to rewrite history to a certain degree. And we get asked that question a lot when we're out there, and it's one of the hardest questions ever, the question of, well, why should we talk to you? We've been talking to the media for 5 years, 7 years, 8 years. You come, you film us, you leave, you go back home, and we're stuck in the same circumstance. What's the point of us talking to you? I mean, how do you even answer that question? And I just tell them, look, I don't know if there is a point in talking to us, but if we end up living in a world where, because of apathy or because of a lack of accountability or whatever the reason is, where journalism ceases to exist, that's a world that frightens me even more than the one that we live in today. And so you keep fighting, you keep trying.
So maybe tell us about a time when you really felt that, with all these efforts and with all this apathy that exists, that you continue to do your work, that you continue to tell these stories that need to be told and that need to be heard, that you really felt that it had an impact somewhere, that you really felt for yourself that you made a difference.
Well, I mean, there's of course the story of Yusuf that you briefly mentioned earlier, and it was Iraq. It was 2007, and it was very similar to the way that Syria is right now, in the sense that people were turning away from the story in Iraq. Our Iraqi colleagues were very demoralized because Baghdad was still in the throes of this horrific violence, with 100 unidentified bodies showing up in the streets every single day, and that was just in the capital. And in the middle of all of this, Wissam, Yusuf's father, comes and knocks on our door, the CNN office's door. I was based there in Baghdad at the time, and his little boy Yusuf, who was just 5 years old at the time, had masked men pour gasoline on his head and set him on fire when he was standing playing outside of his own home. And Yusuf sat there in our CNN Baghdad bureau kitchen, and he could barely open his mouth to eat rice. He was angry. He was lashing out at his family. His father had gone everywhere trying to get his kid help. And then he finally decided to try his chance with the media. And we had a conversation with him saying, look, to be honest, the Iraq story, most people don't really care about it. We don't know what impact it's going to have, but this is, the only thing that we can do. I cannot even begin to, like, I still get goosebumps talking about it right now. And this is, 13 years ago. We put the story out there and the response was just mind blowing. I mean, my email exploded, CNN's phone ringing off the hook. The response came from around the world, transcending nationality, ethnicity, sect, you name it. People wanted to help this little boy. And I remember when I called his parents and I was able to finally say, you're all going to go to America. You're going to get help. I remember going with them and, experiencing their first few days there and just how transformative it was. And I remember also the transformation when it came to our Iraqi staff, because again, this was obviously, their country, their people that were going through all of this suffering. And just to see people rallying around an Iraqi kid, it gave them that little bit of something. And I think that made me realize that, no matter how cynical I can get, the kindness of strangers is out there. There are ways to grab at people, to try to inspire people. And the other striking thing with Yusuf's story is that, fast forward to today, for example, he's just actually started college, which is incredible. And he doesn't remember the attack anymore. He used to, when he was a kid growing up, he would tell me what had happened to him. And then I think when he hit like 13, 14, the memories just they faded. They didn't define his psyche. That horrific act of violence no longer had this extraordinarily negative, psyche defining impact on him. It was balanced by something else, which is also, why his story is really kind of the inspiration behind my wanting to start my charity, because I do believe that, we can make these differences in people's lives. And I do believe that we have to.
Yeah. I was just about to come to Inara. It's like the perfect segue to get into Inara. But just before I do that, you said now Yusuf doesn't even remember that. That's not his defining factor of his life. I want to understand that, along with the kindness, along with the support that he got, are you aware that he ever got any psychosocial support through this process? And how important and how crucial was that for him to, come to where he is today?
He had, of course, absolutely. He had a lot of psychological support to try to get through this. And, without that, how is a young 5-year-old child supposed to navigate his own anger at a life? What fault did he have? What fault did his parents have? And then also coping with, a physical injury like that, going out, having people stare at him constantly, other kids pointing and staring, these are all things that have an effect on a child's development. Not to mention, on top of all of this, and this isn't necessarily something that, we saw in Yusuf per se, but in a lot of the other kids, is your parents are meant to be the ones who protect you. Your parents are meant to have all of the answers. They're who you go to when you're hungry, when you're cold. As a child, to go to their parents under some of these circumstances and their parents be unable to provide that for them has an added trauma on top of it as well. For a child to lose a sense of security inside the home, don't forget, a lot of times violence happens when the children are at home, especially in the context of war and in the context of Syria. When you're robbed as a child of that sense of security within your own home, that's meant to be the safest place for you in the world, that really shakes you to your very core. And so if you're not able to, grow and develop and understand how to reattain that sense of security, how to reattain that confidence, no matter what it is that you may have gone through, how to reattain that, sense of dignity. We don't tend to think a lot of children as needing a sense of dignity, but they do. Then you don't have a chance of actually developing past what it is that you've been through. And this is also why, there is a lot of buzz right now talking about the need for mental health and for psychosocial support. And even though, the need can seem like it's overwhelming, because everybody who has been through these experiences has been deeply, deeply traumatized. It's also one of the most important factors that we need to address, because otherwise these wounds, they just fester, they cycle, they become deeper, they become worse, and they can potentially end up not just impacting the child, but this is one of the reasons, and let's face it, why people tend to turn towards violence. A lot of these organizations out there that are trying to recruit, manipulate young minds do so by giving them a sense of purpose. They do so by manipulating their anger that has been allowed to fester. And so on the one hand, I wish we lived in a world where we provided psychosocial support and mental support to those who needed it because it's the right thing to do. We don't necessarily live in that kind of a world, but at the very least, we live in one where by now we do understand that if we want to break a cycle of violence, we have to be the ones to give a child the tools to be able to break it for themselves.
And so, so coherently and so exact, so on point rather, I want to understand, where did the idea of Inara come into? You speak so passionately about children. Just what you have spoken in the last few minutes has been so passionately about the well-being of children who've been impacted by this, whether it's physical, whether it's mental, whether it's psychological. Where did the idea for Inara come from? And did you feel like that you wanted to have more impact than what you were having as a journalist?
100%. So I shared the story of Yusuf, which is kind of the inspiration out there that helped me realize that, as cynical as I might get, the kindness of strangers is out there. The children in need are out there. The medical institutions that can do something is out there. And we can, pull all these different pieces and put them together so that these kids that are falling through the gaps of pre-existing medical care can actually get help. But, fast forward to Syria, 2012, 13. And again, this apathy that we've been talking about. And I just reached a point where I was just seeing so many kids who were injured, who were just falling through the gaps in access to medical care, or whose parents didn't know how to navigate the system, that it became this idea of, why not do it underneath the umbrella of a charity that can access a lot more kids and actually can have an infrastructure in place to ensure that no child who has been so severely impacted by war is unable to access the medical treatment that they need. And on a personal level, it was a very tough time. And I really reached a point where the journalism wasn't having the impact that I wanted it to have. And I couldn't just not do something, having seen the need over and over again so many times. I almost became obsessed with this idea of having to do more, realizing that I had the tools and the means to be able to do more. And, we see these transformations in the kids that Inara is treating all the time. Yes, we're focused on Syria right now, but hopefully, we have ideas and hopes that we would expand, well beyond that into other areas, because the kids who come through, they go back to school. We give their parents back something that they were robbed of. And quite often that is seeing their child smile again. That's seeing their child laugh again, thrive again. We've been talking about mental health and psychosocial support. We're trying to expand our programs to begin to address that, because, a lot of the times, and I'm sure you hear this too, is you get this sense among people where they say, oh, but the problem is so big. There's so many people in need. Like, what difference do I make? And to that I say, we're not going to change the world alone. Of course we're not. No one person is. But, you should never dismiss the sort of collective impact of what a large number of small acts of kindness can actually do. No donations are too small. No gesture is too insignificant. We've reached a point, and this is kind of also the basis for Inara, where we can't keep waiting for governments to step in and do the right thing. It's not going to happen. If we want to make things better, then we have to start looking out for each other. And for me, in many ways, Inara is my way of doing more and of trying to do better, I guess. to do better by all of the people that I've met throughout the course of my reporting.
Azadi also was built out of a similar thought, exactly a similar thought. While Inara works with children, Azadi works with women. So I just wonder, I know we're running out of time, just two more questions before we go to the audience questions. I just want to understand, in the children that you work with, that Inara works with, have you seen a sense of disproportionate impact in the girl children, or has there been any kind of a difference in the impact of the war or the conflict or just the abuse and the violence that you see in the girl children?
No, there is, not just in the ones that Inara treats, but also, in those that I come across throughout the course of my reporting, whether it's in war zones or in refugee camps. I mean, young girls, young women, teenagers are, of course, among the most vulnerable, not just in terms of the violence, but just in terms of, their own physical security. And then add to that the reality that, for a lot of these families who fled, girls end up being married off at a very, very young age, simply because their families can't afford to care for them anymore, or because frankly, they need the money that they're going to get if they give her away in marriage. Incredibly vulnerable in some of these, scenarios that, you see in the film. That's something that I've reported on as well too. But, that darkness of the camp and having to go out, and just how dangerous these kinds of journeys are for young women. And then of course, you have society's pressure. Unfortunately, part of what we need to do is also to educate the parents so that they don't turn to a daughter who has some sort of physical disability or some sort of scarring that's visible, and make her feel like she's less of a person or she's worthless because she's not going to be able to find a husband. And so, yes, in many aspects of it, girls are vulnerable because they have multiple layers of potential vulnerabilities.
And just the last question, Arwa. I know you've touched upon it, but I want to end on that note. What can people, who feel they can't do enough or who feel they can do, how can we build that, inspire everybody to come out and realize that, these people are just like us, and, that there are geographical boundaries and differences, but ultimately the suffering and everything is pretty much like ours. So what would you say for, to inspire people to do things that they can do in their own way?
The coronavirus pandemic has actually been quite interesting with regards to that, because I think a lot of people before who would maybe, hear the story and think, oh, that's awful, but then turn away, are pausing right now, because everyone's been going through COVID-19. Everyone knows what that initial, fear was like of trying to protect yourself from the virus. And they could all imagine what it would be like to go through that if you didn't have running water or soap or the ability to buy a face mask or the ability to keep your child safe. And so what I say now is obviously different to what I used to say pre-COVID. But I think, for a lot of people, I would deeply encourage them to, look around, be grateful for what you have, and recognize that there are so many people out there who don't have, who can't protect themselves from COVID, who can't physically protect themselves from violence, who are frightened, who need so much more to a certain degree than we will ever be able to give them. But again, no gesture is insignificant. And look, if you can donate to an organization, that's amazing. If you can't, if you can volunteer within your own community with those who have less than you do, that is brilliant as well. Or if you can just go out and a small gesture of kindness to somebody in the street, then that is at least something. Because again, I'm not all, everything's coming up flowers kind of a person, but really, it all starts with us and how we interact with our immediate world and with each other, but also how we interact with the world beyond. And that is our individual responsibility. I mean, we are responsible for the way the world is today. Previous generations are, of course. But if we want it to change, again, that change lies with each and every one of us as individuals.
Well, every word you say is so meaningful and so passionate. Thank you so much. We just have 2 audience questions, so I'm going to take those before we let you go. We have a lot of students watching, and we have some professionals in the, in people who work as humanitarians, people who work in the refugee and the migration space. So somebody has asked here, how do you balance your work as a journalist and a humanitarian? Is it ever conflicting? Is it hard to keep up?
So I get that question a lot, actually. And the short answer is no, there is absolutely no conflict. I am a human being first. We are human beings first. And to reach out and help a fellow human being in need is not a conflict of interest, no matter which way you look at it. But, obviously it is, and it does end up being quite a bit of a balancing act in terms of time. And at the same time, I feel like they complement one another. Look, talk to any journalist out there who covers the same kinds of stories that I cover, and they'll tell you that they feel so helpless so often because so many people need help, and they'll come to us for information because quite often we're in places where we're the only people who aren't part of, what's happening to them. And we can't do a lot most of the time. This gives me one more, tool to be able to say, if they happen to fit into our criteria kind of a thing, here's something that we can do. But, we're not out there reporting coldly on these stories. When we have a solution for somebody, when we are able to, when we are able to help out, we do step in and help out. Everyone who I know does. And we are, many of us, very deeply impacted by what it is that we witness. We feel it and we want to do more. And that's part of what makes us human. And I think, I would never want to go out and cover the kinds of stories that I cover and not feel anything, because the day that starts happening to me, that's the day I need to stop.
Yeah, I hear you. Another question, and this would be the last before we wrap up this session, is a student asked, in a COVID-19 world, if he or she wants to go and work as a humanitarian or a journalist, it's very challenging because it's very difficult to go out on the field. What is your advice?
So we've been having to navigate that as well, obviously, as journalists, and trying to storytell, which is basically storytell via remote. And, since going is not an option to many places, my best advice is to basically do what we do. So we try to find characters to help tell the kind of story that we're trying to tell, and ask them to film selfie videos of their lives, of what it is that they're going through. And then we'll, supplement that with maybe, videos that we've managed to pull from other places. Because at the end of the day, even though you can't physically go there, there's still ways to sort of access someone's story and experiences. And yes, it is very different. It's a very different experience to be sitting at home and trying to tell a story versus actually being out in the field and doing it. But there are ways. I mean, technology has given us ways to connect to each other, even when we can't physically go there. And in terms of the humanitarian work, I mean, look, that's been really difficult because obviously when places lock down, we can't take the kids in for the surgeries that they need sometimes, although we're trying to, navigate around that. And you have to protect yourself and you have to protect your staff. I mean, in many ways, this is uncharted territory for all of us. And I don't think any of us really knows the kind of perfect way to get through this and keep doing our jobs. But I know, at least for me as a journalist, I'm actually reaching out and having fascinating conversations with people that I might not have actually reached out to before. And, you know, a lot of it is more in depth than it would have been before, because we're not out in the field and constrained by time, which we normally are, because, you know, you're out there, you're on a shoot, you're in a rush. Now we kind of can actually pause and take more time with some of these conversations that we're having. That adds an extra different element to it as well.
Yeah. No, Arwa, this is great. Thank you so much for joining us and you know, giving us your time, sharing your experiences, your ideas, your opinions, and suggestions for how, you know, students and professionals can go about this COVID-19 situation. We're now going to play the film for all our viewers who've joined us. It's a 10-minute long film. It's called In Turmoil, and it has been filmed by 4 refugee women from the Moria camp when the Moria camp existed and was not burnt down. So please enjoy the film, and we'll be back on the session after the film.